Today I'm going to talk about the Book of Ecclesiastes. The Book of Ecclesiastes is a book of the Bible in the section of the Bible called the Writings. There are a lot of books in the Writings that are strange or anomalous. Anomaly means to be something that doesn't fit with the rest of the Bible. So we have the Book of Job, which questions the idea that God rewards the good and punishes the evil. In the book of Psalms and in the books of Kings and the book of Deuteronomy, lots of books of the Bible, the assumption is that if you're good, you'll be rewarded, and if you're bad, you'll be punished. But the book of Job opens that to a question. It questions that in a subversive kind of way and said, well, maybe God is not always fair. And Job, who's often called patient, is very impatient. We have the book of the Song of Songs, which is a collection of erotic love poetry. And today I'm going to talk about another very strange book of the Bible. By strange, again, I mean strange to the Bible, as opposed to a lot of the other things in the Bible, a lot of the ideologies and beliefs in the Bible. And this is the book of Kohelet, or the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes starts out by saying, and the translation in front of you says, futility, futility, utter futility. The Hebrew word is hevel, and hevel means like vapor. It's like zero. Zero, zero, everything is zero. And we're struck, wait a minute, the Bible is about meaning. The Bible's about God creating the world for a purpose. The Bible's about human beings being good to each other. And then we're told everything's useless. And so in my own way, I'm going to sort of translate these words. 0, 0, said Kohelet. And Kohelet, you'll see, is a son of David, king in Jerusalem. As in the case of the Song of Songs, where supposedly Solomon is the author. King Solomon, the third king of Israel, son of David, is the author. Solomon, considered to be the wisest man that ever lived. And so it doesn't say Solomon, but it says Kohelet, and Kohelet really means assembler, convoker. That is somebody who's assembling people to teach them. And so why call him Kohelet if it was Solomon? Is this another book of the Bible where a book is attributed to a major figure when it was really written by somebody later and somebody else? So it says 0, 0, everything is zero. What real value is there for a man in all the gains he makes beneath the sun? That is, what good is anything I do? This is a book of the Bible saying everything's zero. What good is it? You have felt this way at some point of your life, maybe at a lot of points in your life. I work so hard, I try so hard, and it's all for nothing. Where did it get me? One generation goes, another comes, but the earth remains the same forever. This is not just about you as an individual. This is about the big picture. That, things don't really change. And one generation comes, the generation comes to life, lives, dies, and then another generation comes and does the same thing. Everything is cyclical. Now that's a key word here, because the Bible is very linear. That is, things are moving towards a good goal, that is the redemption of humankind. The Bible is not cyclical. Pagan religions were cyclical. That is, it didn't matter what you did. It always came around and around, just like the seasons. And this book, as an anomaly, is not linear, it's cyclical. The sun rises. You might remember the Ernest Hemingway novel, The Sun Also Rises. The sun rises and the sun sets and glides back to where it rises. So the winds go and they come, the sun rises and the sun sets, all streams flow into the sea, but the sea is never full, so what good is it? It's like you work a lot and you never get your fill of anything. All such things are wearisome. No man can ever state them. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear enough of hearing. Only that shall happen which has happened, only that occur which has occurred. There is nothing new beneath the sun. What good is anything? There's nothing new. You don't get any place. This is the Bible? This is the Bible telling us that nothing is worth anything, that our work does nothing. Sometimes there's a phenomenon of which they say, look, this is new. Sometimes we think this is really new. Look, in my life, I've seen such new, wonderful things on this earth. And to say there's nothing new, but that's what he's saying. Nothing really changes. Kohelet was king in Jerusalem over Israel. Now we're starting to get a story. So whether this is Solomon or not, or a symbolic king, and he has everything that life can give him, and he's going to go on a kind of intellectual, spiritual exploration about life. Where can I find meaning in life? This is like he's like the first existentialist. You know, what good is existence? What good is life? What is it all about? There was an old movie, What's It All About, Alfie? It's really, what's it all about, Ecclesiastes? What's it all about, Kohelet? That's what he's asking himself. And so he tries different things. There was a Woody Allen movie, I think it was called Hannah and Her Sisters, where Woody Allen is trying to figure out the meaning of life, and he tries different things. I think he was really basing it on this. And he says, I'm going to try different things. So he tries different things. He says, here I've grown richer and wiser than any that ruled before me over Jerusalem, and my mind has zealously absorbed wisdom and learning. And so he tries different things. Money, he's the richest person in the world, doesn't really enjoy it. He tries wisdom. He tries philosophy. He tries parting. He tries all of these things. So here in chapter 2, I venture to tempt my flesh with wine and to grasp folly while letting my mind direct with wisdom. Even while I was parting, I was like examining what was going on, to the end that I might learn which of the two was better for men to practice in their days of life under heaven. I multiplied my possessions. I built myself houses and I planted vineyards. I laid out gardens and groves in which I planted every kind of fruit tree. I constructed pools of water, enough to irrigate a forest shooting up with trees. I bought male and female slaves and I acquired stewards. I acquired more cattle, both herds and flocks, than all were before me in Jerusalem. So he's got everything, and it's not doing any good. And in verse 10, he says, I withheld from my eyes nothing they asked for and denied myself no enjoyment. Rather, I got enjoyment out of all my wealth, and that's all that I got out of my wealth. So he's trying everything, and he's not getting any place. And it's all zero. It's all futile. It's all chasing after the wind. And he thinks that, well, wisdom is superior to folly, but then he starts talking about death. And this guy seems to be quite obsessed with death, because he's thinking, you know, I'm going to die anyway. And if there's a lot in monotheistic religion that has to do with heaven, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And this guy's not buying that. Again, he has his own take on life. And he says, but I also realize that the same fate awaits them both. So I reflected, the fate of the fool is also destined for me. To what advantage then have I been wise? It's verse 17, and so I loathed life. And so I loathed life. This is the Bible. In Deuteronomy, it says, you've got before you life and death. Choose life. The Bible's about finding meaning and purpose in life. And he says, I hate it. I loathe life. It's one thing for Job in the book of Job, who has lost everything, to say, what good is my life? This guy's got everything. Everybody in the world is jealous of him. And he says, it doesn't do me any good. And so I loathe the wealth. And at the bottom here, in verse 24, he says, there's nothing worthwhile for a man but to eat and drink and afford himself enjoyment with his means. And he's saying, eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow you're going to die. And when you die, you're going to die like a dog. I have people who come to me as a rabbi, and they're really depressed. And sometimes I've tried a little experiment. I've given them this book. And I've said, read this book and come back and see me next week. And they come back, they read the book and they come back and see me the next week. And they say, you know what, compared to this guy, I'm fine. I'm doing really well. I thought I was depressed. This guy's depressed. He's intellectually depressed. I can find certain things that are good in life, even though I may be having these problems. This guy makes me feel really much better. And sometimes they'll say, thank you very much. You fixed me up because compared to this guy, I'm fine. Then comes an extremely famous passage, probably the most famous passage in this book. There was a group called the Byrds, I think it was in the 1960s, that had a #1 hit with this. And it's about there's a time to be born, a time to die. You've heard this passage. You've heard this passage say at funerals. There's a time to be born, a time to die. And it's sort of comforting that there's a time for everything. But the people who use this passage, I don't think have read it. I don't think understand its import. There's a season for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for being born and a time for dying, a time for planting, a time for uprooting the planted, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for tearing down and a time for building up, a time for weeping and a time for laughing, a time for wailing and a time for dancing. As we're reading this, we're thinking, yeah, that's right. There are different times in life. Sometimes you laugh, sometimes you cry. There's sometimes you tear down, sometimes you build up. There is a time to be born. There is a time to die. So this is making sense, and we think it's very beautiful. A time for throwing stones and a time for gathering stones, a time for embracing, a time for shunning embraces, a time for seeking and a time for losing, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for ripping and a time for sewing, a time for silence and a time for speaking, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for war and a time for peace. If I remember correctly, the Bird song said, a time to love, a time to hate, a time for peace. I hope it's not too late. So they changed these last words. They didn't want to say there's a time for war. This is the 1960s we're talking about. And so, but the passage seems to make a lot of sense to our sensibilities, that there's a time for everything. But then if you keep reading, you realize what he's really talking about. What value then can the man of affairs get from what he earns? I have observed the business that God gave man to be concerned with. He brings everything to pass precisely at its time. Oh my goodness, he's talking about predestination. Everything is predestined. Let's go back 15 steps. Before there was Judaism, you had a pagan worldview where you had human beings and you had the gods, and above them you had the fates or fate. And the gods didn't really decide everything. The gods were often opposed to each other. If you remember the Iliad by Homer, you had some on the side of the Danaans, the Greeks, some gods on the side of the Greeks, some gods on the side of the Trojans, and they're fighting each other for 10 years outside the walls of Troy. But it doesn't really matter because the fates, the blind fates, had decided that Greece was going to win, that the Greeks were going to win. It was all fated to begin with. So for all the heroics of Achilles and Hector and the tricks of Odysseus, for all these things, the Greeks were going to win anyway because it had been fated. These blind ladies stuck a needle into the tapestry of life, and they decided that the Greeks were going to win, or fate or luck or chance decided that. So what the human beings do in that system doesn't matter. Well, Judaism doesn't believe that. Judaism, we believe that God, who is the highest power, that God sees, that again, going back to the book of Job, God rewards the good and punishes the evil. It's a moral universe. This other universe is an amoral universe, that pagan universe. And Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, has taken us back incredibly to that other universe, that other worldview of how we look at the big picture. So he's saying, the reason he's saying a time to be born and a time to die, a time to love and a time to hate, is it's not up to you anyway. God's going to tell you, or a fate is going to tell you when you're going to love and when you're going to hate and when you're going to be born and when you're going to die and when there's going to be a war and when there's going to be peace. It doesn't have anything to do with you, and these things are going in cycles anyway. I realize too that whatever God has brought to pass will recur evermore. Nothing can be added to it and nothing taken from it. And God has brought to pass that men revere him. God has even controlled that people should believe in God. Verse 17 of chapter 3, I mused, God will doom both righteous and wicked, for there's a time for every experience and for every happening. That's what's going on here. God has decided this. And so it doesn't matter whether you're righteous or wicked. In the book of Job, you have a man saying, sometimes God can be unfair. Sometimes God will make it so that bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. This guy, Ecclesiastes, is saying, right, it's all the same whether you're righteous or good. He's taken us back to an amoral universe. This is in the Bible. This is an anomaly. This is strange. And the book goes on, and with a lot of proverbs, and he will say, look, it's better to be rich than to be poor. It's better to go to the temple than not to go to the temple. He does sort of modify things, but he's going over these things over and over. I'm in chapter 5, verse 9. A lover of money never has his fill of money, nor a lover of wealth his fill of income. That too is futile. As his substance increases, so do those who consume it. And he's saying, you know what? It doesn't matter how much money you have. You're going to die anyway, and it's going to go to somebody else. By the way, he doesn't seem to have children. I'm not sure if he's even married or not, but he doesn't seem to have any regard for anybody else. It's all about him. You know, people like that? And so if he makes a lot of money and he dies and he can't take it with him, I've known people who literally wanted to take cash with them in their caskets, but that's another story. It's a good story, but that's another story. I didn't let them. I made them give it to charity, but that's another story. And so he says that since you can't take it with you, what good is it? And so he keeps coming back to, so just enjoy yourself, because that's all there is. And the book goes on with lots of maxims and lots of sayings. But at the very end, there's a very beautiful poem. And for those of us who are a little bit older, it's really quite upsetting and quite depressing. I'm in chapter 11, verse 9. O youth, enjoy yourself while you're young. Let your heart lead you to enjoyment in the days of your youth. Follow the desires of your heart and the glances of your eyes, but know well that God will call you to account for all such things. And banish care from your mind, and pluck sorrow out of your flesh, for youth and black hair are fleeting. Then comes this poem. So, and disregard the fact that there's a difference between chapter 11 and 12. So appreciate your vigor in the days of your youth. If you're listening to this and you're young, enjoy it. Because there are days of sorrow that are coming, and there are years that are going to come that say, I have no pleasure in them. And then comes this poem. When the guards of the house become shaky, and the men of valor are bent, and the maids that grind grow few or idle, and the ladies that peer through the windows grow dim, and the doors to the street are shut, with the noise of the handmill grown fainter, and the song of the bird grown feebler, and all the strains of music dying down, when one is afraid of heights and there's terror on the road. If you know anybody who's older, or if you're listening to this and you're older, you understand this poem. It's not just that you lose your dark hair. It's like the whole world, the doors of the street are shut. It reminds me of a Doors song. You get to be afraid of heights. You're scared of everything. I know a lot of people who are older, and they've become much more frightened about everything over time. And there's terror on the road, for the almond tree may blossom, the grasshopper be burdened, and the caper bush may bud again. But man sets out for his eternal abode, with mourners all around on the street, before the silver cord snaps and the golden bowl crashes. If this sounds like Henry James, it's because this is where he got it. The jar is shattered at the spring, and the jug is smashed at the cistern, and the dust returns to the ground as it was. That comes from the Garden of Eden story. From dust you came, and to dust you'll return. And the life breath returns to God who bestowed it. And then he comes back full circle to utter futility. 0, 0, everything is 0. So after 12 chapters, he starts with 0, he ends with 0. It's almost like, how a 0 is an oval, is a round. It all comes around, and it's all nothing. Now, this book made it into the Bible. I can't imagine how. But I think it's because of what some editor did at the end. This is no longer Kohelet talking. This is like an afterword by some editor. A further word, because Kohelet was a sage, he continued to instruct the people, He listened to and tested the soundness of many maxims. Kohelet sought to discover useful sayings and recorded genuinely truthful sayings. The sayings of the wise are like goads, like nails fixed on prodding sticks. They were given by one shepherd. So what is he saying? Don't take this stuff so seriously. This is to goad you. This is to make you think. And by the way, it works. Because if you read this book, or if you've listened to what I've said about this book, right, you say, well, wait a minute, I don't believe that. Things are better than that. It's like the people who I sent to read the book when they were depressed. This prods you, it goads you. Well, wait a minute, no, I do believe in some things. I don't believe that life is zero. And so this editor is saying, yeah, that's exactly what he's trying to do. He didn't really mean it. He didn't really mean any of this stuff. By the way, I don't agree. I think he meant every word. But this gets into the Bible by saying, no, this is just provocative. It's like a Socratic dialogue, like Socrates, like pressing his students. And then another editor comes along and says, a further word. Against them, my son, be warned. The making of many books is without limit, and much study is wearing of the flesh. A book like this, you really don't even need to read it. Incidentally, the rabbis of the Talmud didn't like Kohelet at all. The sum of the matter, comes a pious editor to say, when all is said and done, revere God and observe his commandments. Okay, after all of this, somebody comes in, just be Jewish. Just observe the commandments, do the mitzvot, don't listen to anything you just heard. If you did hear it, let it goad you into being good. For it applies to all mankind that God will call every creature to account for everything unknown, be it good or bad. There is going to be accounting. Don't listen to this guy who said it doesn't matter whether you're righteous or wicked. It does matter, and God does reward and God does punish. And then it repeats that same line again. So I think it made into the Bible because it was probably very popular, and people needed this. And the way I think about it is it's a door. I know people who've read this book and say, you know what, if Judaism can include this in its Bible, then I'm allowed to think for myself. Judaism is always about questioning, right? You can say anything you want. And imagine, he said anything he wanted. He said, life is zero. Life is cyclical. It's not linear. You're going to die like a dog. God's going to, it doesn't care whether you're righteous or wicked. He can say all of those things, and his book can make it into the Bible. And that, again, is the pluralism of Judaism and the beauty of Judaism, that you're allowed to think for yourself. You're allowed to feel for yourself. You can question anything. And if you're saying it sincerely and you're saying it with truth, anything is acceptable. There's complete freedom of the mind, complete freedom of the spirit. But we hope, at least now I'll just add my own personal word, I hope you feel better than this guy, because he was pretty miserable. But even in his misery, he came around to saying, you know what, I'm going to at least find some enjoyment in life. I hope that everybody gets at least that, but I hope you get more. I hope you get meaning and purpose, and you have a wonderful life.